Michael W. Smith is a Grammy and Dove Award-winning artist who has been creating music and performing for the last 4 decades. In addition to having sold over 15 million albums, he's an author who has written over a dozen books, including his newest title, The Way of the Father: Lessons from My Dad, Truths About God. This heartwarming book honors the legacy of his dad, Paul Smith, and reveals how he poured the love of his Heavenly Father on Michael at the times he needed it most. Please welcome Michael W. Smith.
Hey there, welcome. So good to have you in the house.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me on. Thanks.
Well, so many have loved your music, but for those who are maybe new to the program or new to faith, maybe tell us a little bit about your journey and your music.
I grew up in West Virginia, grew up in a little Baptist church. My mom was church secretary. My dad was an oil refinery worker. Sports was a big thing in our family, but also, wrote my first song when I was 5. It was awful, but the fact that I created something at 5 and then I could play Beatles songs without any sheet music kind of astounded my mom and dad. So grew up singing, a lot of the youth musicals that were coming out back then, Tell It Like It Is, Natural High, Ralph Carmichael. That takes me back a long way. And then 15 years of age, I felt like there was a call of God in my life to explore this world of music, and didn't know how to get there, didn't know what the rules were, and found myself packing up in an old beat up Chevrolet and moving to Nashville, Tennessee, which was about 6 hours away from Canova, West Virginia. And that was 1978. And I never went back. I went back every 3 months to get some money. I was pretty poor back then. And then 2.5 years later, met a girl named Amy Grant, started writing songs for her Age to Age record, and found myself on the road opening up for her. And I guess after 34 records, the rest is history on some level.
Wow. Art has not just been your music, but your writing. And I want to talk about this book that you have coming out called The Way of the Father, where you're actually writing about your dad. So tell us a little bit about that and how it connects to the faith journey.
Yeah. Well, my dad was my mom and dad were just simply amazing. My dad went to heaven in November of 15. He had dementia, and I still miss him terribly to this day. He was the kindest man I'd ever known in my life who happened to be my dad. His glass was always half full. He laughed and smiled every day. He looked for the best in people. He was my baseball coach all growing up, and I refer a lot of the stories are told in the book. And he was my biggest fan when I decided that I didn't want to play for the Cincinnati Reds, that this music was going to be a part of my life. And he kind of became my PR agent. I think the only time I ever saw him get mad was when my songs didn't go number 1. He couldn't quite figure that out. And I would always tell him, I said, Dad, all my songs can't go number 1. And he would say things like, well, why not, son? You're the best. And so he just affirmed me my whole life. And I say this in the book. I said, I really do believe that my dad showed me what God is like on many levels, because he was kind, he was patient, and he was for me my whole life. So I knew one day that I would write a book about him. But when he got dementia in 2011, I started to recollect all those stories and all those memories, especially of us on the baseball field. And so 2020 was a great time to write a book. So, but it was the right timing. But I think what's beautiful about the book is that, there are these amazing, funny, hilarious, heart-wrenching at times talking about my dad, but all these stories, and it just sort of, I kind of make a reference to a promise of God, and sort of, it paints a picture of who God is like, so in each chapter I do that. So it was a joy to write. And I'm really, really happy with it. And just honoring my dad.
Well, it's a wonderful book. You said in 2020, so you actually wrote it during 2020 when everything was shut down and everybody was cloistered around. It must have been hard for you as a musician. You're so used to shows and big events and touring, and that's even like kind of an adrenaline rush, I'm sure, to get up in front of thousands of people and do these, even though they're worship things. I mean, a lot of them, it just means an incredible electric energy, and to have that all kind of go away must have been a super shock for someone like you.
Well, it was a little bit, but I found myself writing a lot of songs, obviously writing a book, but I found myself in the studio writing a lot. I obviously found some great, wonderful time to be with my family, which I feel like I'm with them all the time anyway. But so I did this 13 weeks in a row. I did sort of worship around the world. That was a real joy for me to
Yeah.
I would do these concerts from my living room or from the farm or from my studio and just kind of pour my life into people. It was the biggest shows I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
There'd be a million people tuning in on that one event,
So that's what I'm
like
getting
one
at is
particular night.
you would do these. So instead of going to the big live venues like a Honda Center or something, you're doing it. You have this camera, but you still have this massive. It must have been a weird experience in a way to like not see as many of the people, but to know like, oh my gosh, this is a huge audience.
Yeah, you knew they were watching. And so you just kind of, I would pray through every one of those episodes. I was just going, God, let me just be in the zone. And, these people are hurting and they're confused and, they don't have a lot of answers. There's a lot of people who don't have hope and they're kind of in despair. So Lord, let me say the right things. Let me sing the right things. And it was all just about just reaffirming people that you know what, you're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. And so I've gotten tremendous feedback. I kind of wish I would have done it every weekend. Part of me wish I hadn't stopped.
Yeah.
But obviously now things are kind of back in full swing, and it's nice to be back out on the road.
And of course, it was out of a lot of that you wrote this book about your dad, and I think it's such a gift to so many people. What's the main takeaway that you think you really hope people read when they read the story about you and your father? You really hope that, like, what's the big encouragement that you would hope people would take from this?
Probably the Jeremiah passage, that we're all familiar with, have plans for you to prosper you. I could name all kinds of promises of God that the book talks about, but I would say it takes me back to a Brennan Manning quote. I was a huge Brennan Manning fan and his writing, but I remember one time, and it reminded me of my dad, when he said, God not only loves you, but he actually really likes you.
Yeah.
And he's extremely fond of you. And that sounds exactly like my dad, and that sounds exactly like Abba as well. So that's the takeaway.
Your dad's love was so strong for you. It was such a reflection of how God's love is for all of us, even if we didn't have a good dad or maybe grew up without a dad, that the whole time the love.
And I refer to that too, because there was a part of me when I wrote this book on, there's going to be a lot of people out there that didn't have a good dad like my dad. But I have so many friends who had so many abusive childhoods, and my mom being one of them, who was abandoned when she was 8 years old, and her 3 younger siblings by my real grandmother, who drove off and never came back.
Wow.
And my mom turned a corner. She just somehow I think she had a real encounter with the Lord and just decided that was not going to happen to her family. And she's one of the most godliest women I've ever known. And so there's a way out. There's a way to let God father or mother you if you didn't have a very good childhood. I know that beyond a shadow of a doubt.
The book is called The Way of the Father. I really want to encourage you at home to get a copy of this book. You'll be super encouraged. Thank you, Michael, so much for joining us. We really appreciate your story and your heart for the Lord, and continue to write great books and great music.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Godspeed.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
Thank you.